My name is Mary McIntyre and the title of the exhibition is Reconstructions, A Room for Mike Kelly. So I was obviously aware of Mike Kelly as an artist because he's such an important figure in the American art scene, but I hadn't really explored his work in detail until I saw a large museum retrospective in Amsterdam. And it was there that I saw a whole range of his practice: sculpture, video, performance. And it was the performance work that really interested me the most. Obviously, at that point, Mike Kelly wasn't there performing, but they had performance documentation of live works that he made between 1970 and the 1990s. And what really struck me about that performance documentation was that the difference between the way that performance is documented today and the way that it would have been documented at that time. Because now whenever you go to see a performance, there's a huge number of people taking photographs on their phone or videoing on their phone. People are there documenting it in video and photography, and there's almost too much documentation. And very often I feel the act of documenting in contemporary performance tends to ruin the experience to some degree for the viewer, because there's nearly as much documentation going on as there are audience members. But back in the 1970s, of course, particularly in Mike Kelly's early works, the photographs were taken in a very spontaneous, immediate way. They were very much in the moment, and there was maybe only 1 or 2 photographs per performance, and not all of the performance work had been documented. So what was on show in the museum actually didn't give away very much context around the performances themselves. And looking at the performance documentation, it was clear that Mike Kelly used an awful lot of objects and props in his live works. Some of these, I've learned since, were quite randomly selected, and others were specifically made to use as props that he would activate in the performance works in his studios and during these larger performance gatherings. It was curious to see the combination of objects that he'd used. Some of them, the pieces that he'd made himself, were quite unfamiliar, and other objects were just ordinary, everyday household objects. But when he brought them together in the performance space, they were really quite bizarre. And it reminded me of an interview that I had seen between the writer Iris Murdoch and Bertrand Russell, who talked about if we study the objects that we use every day and are very familiar with, and we look at them for a long time, we realise how odd they are. And I think that that's something that Mike Kelly achieved in his performance works, this idea of oddness. When you bring these things together, these different juxtapositions can seem quite strange, and suddenly the familiar objects become unfamiliar. And as an artist, I was having conversations with Robert about this, because Robert's work as an artist, it may be three-dimensional, whereas mine is more photography and installation, but there's something in the themes that we work with and the concerns that we have in our practices that is quite in sync. And the conversations we were having at that time, it became evident that a lot of the things I was discussing, that I had thought about Mike Kelly's performance documentation, he was also very interested in his own practice. So that's really how the collaboration began. It took us quite a long time to work together on this project because it was happening alongside our solo work as artists. And also there were various interruptions. We weren't living in the same country for some of the time, but the conversations carried on over the years, backwards and forwards, and gradually, bit by bit, we were able to get together and make the different works that you see in the exhibition. One of the pivotal decisions we made in reconstructing the works was to remove the figure. And obviously the figure is one of the main elements within performance or live works. For some time, I'd been making work that was devoid of the figure. And in the interiors that I photographed in my own practice, I became aware that the furniture and the objects that were in the interiors took on very figurative aspects. They almost became a stand-in for the figure. And this is something that Mike Kelly was interested in as well in some of his installations, where he would use soft toys, for example, as a stand-in for human beings when he was exploring ideas around empathy and how he could evoke or deny audience empathy as people interacted with his works. So that decision to remove the figure became a very important aspect of the work. And we began to find that as we constructed the performance environments within our work, the objects that were in those environments became very figurative, either in the way they physically appeared in the photographs or the relationships one object would have with another, or that the objects would suggest human interaction. For example, there's a drum in one of the photographs, and I think that as soon as we see an object like that that we can relate to, that's part of our understanding of the world and the things that we use in the world, obviously that starts to create a narrative within the viewer's mind. Because without contextual information, we begin to create our own stories and our own narratives around it based on our memories or the experiences that we may have had as viewers. When we were constructing the installations, we were meticulously setting up the objects in juxtapositions that he himself had used that replicated what was going on in the photographic documentation with exactness, so that the perspective between things, the scale of things, the way they inhabited the space, the relationships between the objects, the lighting, all of these things were constructed in a way which really stayed very, very faithful to his performance documentation. And it was interesting that we really felt strongly that there was something of Mike Kelly's presence within that, or the presence of the performance and the presence of the performer, even though they were absent. And those figurative elements came through to the degree that that's really, I think, where the title of the exhibition grew out of. It was a working title that we used, but I think the idea of a room for Mike Kelly became a very dominant feature of the work, because we almost felt sometimes as if Mike Kelly was about to walk through the door of the wooden room. There definitely was the presence of him as the person who had activated these collections of objects.
My name's Robert Anderson. I'm an artist who's primarily concerned with the relationship between images and objects. That really is the starting point for the interest in this project, working with Mary McIntyre. Specifically, I'd always been interested in the line between things that may have value or status, as opposed to things that might be supporting or supplemental. So for example, the kind of line between where physical elements might be supports or plinths or things that are secondary to the artworks, and at what point those things become artworks in their own right. And similarly with the status of photography, or the image, where this is something that documents and supports an event or an action or a set of physical elements. And alternately, where that, the line where that becomes more important and it becomes an artwork, a photographic artwork, or an image-based artwork in its own right. So I suppose the first two images are quite crucial, really, that we made together, which you'd encounter in the upper gallery. These two images have a kind of correspondence throughout the work, and they're sort of indexed in a series of platforms and other materials in the objects, but probably most sort of obviously with the structure that sits in the sunken gallery. This is a kind of direct reference point to the sort of screen or partition that you see in those two photographs. But what you don't really kind of have access to is the space in the round, the space in itself. So it's deliberately a kind of fictional or sort of imagined reconstructed space, which is meant to reflect this area that the performers work in. It deliberately has a kind of skewed or distorted scale to it, which again relates to a lot of the other smaller objects that Kelly seems to be preoccupied with in his practice. So there are other areas of the exhibition which try to work with these mirrored or partitioned components. One of them is the display table that you'll see with the majority of the objects, which kind of mimics the sort of chevron pattern that you would see in a lot of the Afghan rugs and arena works that Kelly seemed to be fascinated by, and often use them as a kind of device in themselves to channel the audience around the work or kind of stop them from kind of going into the work. And this is another area that I think myself and Mary were really intrigued by, was the way that within these kind of documented images there was a barrier or a kind of restriction to the way that you might access the objects. And then within the objects, really they're a sort of reversal of that condition, where you don't see them as photographs or images, but you see them as physical things in themselves, which are a kind of stand-in or a surrogate for the person or the body. Kelly often talked about this idea of sort of embodied character and the notion of absence as presence, and really the point where props from performances become objects in their own right, or as with the history of kind of installation art, where the photographs seem to take over the importance in terms of the artwork and the event. What sort of interests me most in the making of the objects for this exhibition is not having access to all of the material qualities of the work, quite often being confronted by images which only show one side or one facet, don't really show the kind of direct detail or kind of material quality or surface quality, and these things have to be filled in and imagined. So that's kind of an interesting way to work, which sort of relates to a lot of the other elements in the practice. Again, the sunken structure, this kind of filling in of the shape or scale of the space, which has a kind of strangely elongated ceiling and a kind of narrowed back. Also with other objects that you kind of encounter later on and you realise that perhaps they're not quite as big or they're slightly smaller. So this kind of uncertainty is quite an interesting way to work. Alternately, what's quite interesting about working in that way is that these objects kind of become unique in their own right, because they're not entirely constructed accurately or faithfully to the originals. There is this sort of sense that they are fictionalised in their own right, but they also have a kind of unique quality or sort of personal quality that's quite different from Kelly's work. This again I think is quite interesting in mirroring some of the aspects of the performances and the sort of fictionalisation of events and details that happen in performance art. Again, there's this kind of sense of mirroring or working with oppositional values in the work. The idea of time-based practice and performance art has a natural sort of connection with something that's durational and quite often protracted or drawn out. This just sort of has a direct correspondence again, I think, with the collaborative process, but also thinking about Kelly's practice over a period of time and the way that he talks about his interest in where these works start to change and become more important and move away from the performance or the painting practice and back into sort of object-based arrangements. And then sort of conversely, the way that this comes back round into photographic documentation. So again, thinking about these ideas of high and low value and sort of status of objects, and these things that are sometimes very everyday and become transformed into something else. Kelly seemed to work with this idea of fiction and false memory, a body of work called Educational Complex, where he looks at people's sort of universal experience of education and ways of trying to remember that truthfully or faithfully in a series of works which kind of reconstruct his own educational history. So in a way what Kelly's doing is giving us license to reproduce his works and think about the act of reproduction in the same sort of way.
Working collaboratively has been a very enriching experience, because I think sometimes as an artist working independently you become so used to that and you can make decisions on the spot and you can almost develop the work as you go immediately from one moment to the next. But working collaboratively, having those conversations and those discussions, a certain kind of special dialogue comes out of that I think really helps develop the work in a way which obviously, had you just been making the work on your own, that doesn't happen. And I think that there was such a lot of complex nuance and so many different elements and considerations, which is another reason why we worked on this project for so long. And it took us so long to make each individual photograph and each individual object that you see in the gallery, was because the dialogue that was going on within the collaboration was bringing out further thoughts, further nuance, further subtlety. And I think that that's something that is very unique to a collaborative process, that working on your own as an artist doesn't quite come to the fore.